Hi, everyone. Today I'll be presenting our first little bit of a pitch of the group's work that we're doing here. And we're trying to look at bigger pictures as different narratives and stories unfold actually developed. And so we're looking at drivers of post-fire delay mortality in these temperate rainforests, although maybe now they are seasonally dry forests and we should stop using the word rainforest in the P&W. While I'm the one presenting today here, most of this work has been led by current and former grad and undergrad students, including Sebastian Busby, Elpor Hersey, and also Alec that you just heard about. While you're all well aware that we're facing an unprecedented increase in fire activity across the West, including the P&W, and after these three talks, hopefully it's more solidified the notion that post-fire delay mortality is an important yet understudied ecological process. Also, and that while the large-scale MTBS assessment of burn severity is useful, but it doesn't really tell the entire story of tree and forest mortality, we can start actually looking at this particular issue more in detail. While there is ongoing research on post-fire delay mortality, just showing the previous talk a couple of the work in the warmer and drier California and also southwestern US, we're still at a really incipient stage. And there's lots to learn about the underlying mechanisms of delay mortality. A relatively recent review piece that highlights research gaps includes the following. There is a big need to quantify uncertainty and incorporate new regions and new species. And that goes, of course, into the functional traits of those species to resist and recover from fire, of course, through the lens of post-fire delay mortality. Conduct basic physiological research on proximate and ultimate causes of fire-induced tree mortality. And if I may add, and using also an elephant, but in a different sense, we think that there is also a need to identify and integrate cross-scale patterns that can feed into understanding the drivers of post-fire delay mortality for a more comprehensive understanding. In parallel, there's been regional to global scale studies on drought-mediated mortality that have been reported that tree height is actually a pretty good predictor, among others, of tree vulnerability, in the absence of fire, of course, and also tree mortality due to drought, which in turn could potentially explain some of the findings of post-fire tree mortality. As an example of the importance of post-fire delay mortality, a study by Geronimo et al. Reported that in the California Sierras after the Rim fire, that most delay mortality was composed of larger and taller trees. And out of all the trees that actually have died, which was post-fire mortality, that is to say, a quarter of those happened very early, between 1 year and 4 years post-fire. Furthermore, in dry forests, extensive delay mortality due to pre-fire drought is reflected in reduced radial growth and competition, as I showed before, but we don't really know the story for our formerly wet forest. And again, what's going to be the story due to the heat wave of 2021 on delay mortality after the 2020? So in our group, we have a number of ongoing efforts to answer some of these questions using spatial statistics, GIS, remote sensing, sensors of radial growth and micro-hydroclimate, field surveys, and also tree ring techniques to better understand patterns and mechanisms of post-fire delay mortality, so that we can translate this science and inform a better management, including the work, again, that Alec and April are leading. We're also monitoring continuously the impact of the post-fire heat wave on delay mortality across different burn severity classes, stratified by tree height, and also looking at tree scale competition and low elevation dark fir western hemlock forest at the Andrews. In here, we have a pilot studies just focusing on western hemlocks, where we are collecting data on a semi-continuous way since July 2021 on radial growth changes microclimate, and saltwater content and potential. We also have been looking at the effects of climate pre and post-fire on post-fire delayed mortality by tree height and also tree scale competition, now at high elevation silver fir and mountain hemlock forests in the Cascades. We're looking at two sites. We're looking at the 2008 Nile Ridge fire at Mount Hood and also the 2011 Shadow Lake fire right nearby Mount Washington. These two sites were part of a larger study that was led by Sebastian Busby on patterns, drivers, and implications of post-fire delay mortality in temperate conifer forests of the western US. And I'll be presenting most of those results here for the remaining of the talk. This work is currently in revision, and the questions are, what is the spatial extent of delay mortality? How is delay mortality related to initial burn severity, soil moisture, and topography? And how do fire and biophysical drivers predict delay mortality? Sebastian used 30 fires from the southern Rockies, northern Rockies, and the Cascades, 10 in each. In each of these fires that were studied, at least had to have 75% forest and occurred between 2008 and 14. And each of them at least had to have large patches of high severity, 10 hectares or larger. And again, we're looking at upper montane subalpine forests for the Cascades and northern Rockies, and sparser, drier conifer forests in the southern Rockies. To answer these questions, the task entailed quantifying large-scale patterns of post-fire delay mortality between 1 year and 5 year post-fire. This work turned out, as Matt also alluded already, to be quite challenging in terms of detecting remotely the actual signature of mortality and delay mortality as vegetation recovery greens up, and on the other end, in an opposite direction, tree mortality signals continue to develop, and that is quite confusing. Sebastian, due to that challenge and due to the also availabilities of images of high resolution, including planet and NAPE, we ended up using a 5-year post-fire period that we proposed as a useful compromise for quantifying what we call representative delay mortality at the landscape scale, yet under limited vegetation and tree recovery, which help us reduce classification errors. As I alluded to, he used Planet Eye satellite imagery at 5 megapixels, then following a classification workflow developed by Kyle Rodman of binomial maps that were created and validated using NAPE and conducted on each fire perimeter individually. Data analysis, the response variable again is the probability of post-fire delay mortality. He used fire effects, immediate fire effects at the 30-meter resolution using the RBR metric, topography and soil moisture, climate moisture deficit, both long-term 30-year average and also post-fire, immediate post-fire. And we also rely on boosted regression trees, and this way also delay or not delay mortality logistically models. Results. So quite a bit of delay mortality. Here you have the list of the 30 fires on the y-axis, on the x-axis. Delay mortality as a percentage of the initial 1 year post-fire. And then in green you have the Cascades, purple in northern Rockies, and brown, light brown, the southern Rockies. So there's quite a bit of variability from year to year, from only 5 all the way to 25 of the original fire perimeter found in the High Park fire in the southwest. As you would expect, the actual variation is less, but it still exists when we look at the patterns at the ecoregion level, between 12 and 16. To me, surprisingly, I had expected the Northern Rockies to actually experience higher delay mortality than the Cascades. If we look now at the actual drivers of post-fire delay mortality, and this came up also before, the idea that we have different, perhaps, edges or margins of populations that are more stressful. One of them could be drier, colder, the other one could be wetter. One of them actually enhances the idea of mortality due to that fire injury. The other one promotes competition. And so many out of the 9 predictors that were analyzed, 6 of them report U-shaped responses. This is the figure that Meg told you not to look at. So these are partial dependence plots showing predictors of post-fire delay mortality, probability order from the most important to the least important, from the left to the right. And color responses curve and variable importance percentages, if you can read it from the very back of the room, in each panel are associated with ecoregion specific. So for instance, in black, we have the average of them, and then in purple, we have the Northern Rockies. The most important predictor was the actual immediate first-order burn severity, 1 year post-fire, across all 3 regions, explaining, on average, 21. This is so small, I cannot read it. In sparse forests in the Southern Rockies, increased post-fire delay mortality resulted from both higher immediate mortality, but also post-fire competition with rapidly recovering shrubs. And so as you can see, we have the actual increase in burn severity. I don't see the red dots, but somewhere in there, I'm colorblind, so I don't see the reds. But to the opposite values, you have a positive relationship, whereas the yellow-brown of the Southern Rockies actually also increased mortality with very low severity. And the way we explain that is that, again, remember that this immediate is 12 months after the actual fire. During that time, we interpret that under very low severity of burn severity, there was an increase in a rapid response of mostly shrubs. The second most important predictors were elevation. Again, we have our U-shaped nonlinear relationship, high and low elevations, but again, not an intermediate, what we can think also not just immediate fire refugia, but actually a post-fire delay mortality refugia in the middle or mid conditions. And perhaps more intuitive, the idea that at lower soil moisture conditions, we see more delay mortality. The third most important predictors were drought, both in the long term, in a sense of long-term productivity, as well as post-fire short-term departures, plus some in and under weather conditions that, again, we alluded to competition. Interactions were actually very interesting as well. The strongest interactions turned out to be between drought, both short and long term. Here you can see for all Oregon regions in the x-axis, you see post-fire climate moisture deficit, departure or deviation from the long term, and just looking at the post-fire. On the right panel and on the left panel, you see the longer term as an average annual deficit. And then in the y-axis, you see the best individual non-interactive predictors, the RBR burn severity metric. And so you can see that post-fire delay mortality response intensified due to interacting high moisture deficit as well as high burn severity. So for both metrics of climate, at higher values, we see where the higher delay mortality took place. However, if we unpack that summary of the 3 ecoregions into individual region stories of findings, we see first very large variation among ecoregions, with the strongest ecoregion-specific interactions at the bottom in the Southern Rockies and the weakest all the way up in the Cascades, and some in-between patterns in the Northern Rockies. Differences in interaction thresholds suggested here with my red rectangles and squares suggest that ecoregion specifics, again, back to functional traits, landscape patterns, sizes of the patches, and so on and so forth, from the dominant tree species all the way to forest type and understory types and overall productivity really are interacting and explaining these results. My summary takeaway is that conifer tree mortality is related to fire effects occurring and are occurring at an ecologically important rate beyond 1 year post-fire at larger landscape scales. Initial burn severity, a 30-meter resolution, is a strong proxy for both fire injuries but also of competition that drive post-fire delay mortality responses, especially at trailing and leading edges. Fire injuries and or competition interact with average and post-fire droughts to intensify mortality responses. Post-fire delay mortality responses are likely to have the greatest negative impact on forest recovery in dry, sparser conifer forests of the Southern Rockies, and potentially elsewhere with dry conditions or with very rapidly drying conditions. Although forest type and ecoregion specific, we think that the 5-year proposed window here for post-fire peer analysis might be an imperfect yet useful compromise for quantifying post-fire delay mortality at a landscape scale in the Western US. And with that, thank you so much. We have 7 minutes for questions. Maybe we could start with Matt, and then Alec, and then me, April, and then me, Andres. Or, I don't know, any preference?
You can get Sebastian up here, too.
Yeah, Sebastian is here if you want to ask him questions. Yes.
I have a question for Matt or anyone who's panel, really. I guess anecdotally in the forest, I see fire-rated trees producing a lot of drones and seeds. So does the literature speak to how these potentially delayed mortality trees might be producing more seed? And if so, pairing that with delayed mortality mapping and locations could help managers determine where potential seed sources coming into a large fire area?
Yes, so the question, I guess, was whether there might be stress crops that are produced after that, and I'm not really sure about that. I think Andrew Larson's work in the Warner Creek fire, they found a lot of regeneration suggested that, but I'm not quite an expert.
Yeah, actually, maybe we should ask that questions to Sebastian, but that was part of one of his chapters that he looked at the actual regeneration that was not there due to the delay mortality. And observationally, anecdotically, there were many sites that you would see the clumps of seedlings or saplings, and there were no adult live trees. You want to add something to that? We should repeat the question. I don't know if Sebastian listened to the question from the back.
Sorry, I didn't completely capture the question, the original question.
I think the part of the question was, sort of looking at how the loss of cones and live trees following delayed mortality might affect subsequent regeneration patterns. Is that?
I guess, do fire-killed trees that are about to die produce more cones, and therefore is that something to pair with delayed mortality mapping to understand reseeding potential in a large fire area?
That's a super good question. I don't have an answer for you, as I unfortunately didn't assess that. I don't know that we have a super good understanding yet on seed production in response to disturbance events. I know that there's some research on it, but it's a tricky, being able to quantify seed production and do that field work to actually look that up is pretty difficult work. And in response to a disturbance specifically, you're gonna have to move really rapidly to start measuring things as opposed to being in a situation where you're maybe just monitoring a site continuously over time and you have funding and resources to do that. But could be potentially an experiment to check out in a place like the H.J. Andrews Forest, which has been monitored for a long time, but has experienced this opportunistic fire event, and now the conditions are ripe to start studying that. So it's an interesting topic. I hope someone looks into it.
Andres, I think this question is primarily for you, but maybe others can talk about it. To what extent can these studies pick up on the effects of post-fire erosion, flooding, thinking specifically to a couple of the fires in the southern Rockies, High Park and Waldo Canyon, both were followed up by some pretty severe post-fire flooding and coastal erosion. I don't know if that's going to be widespread enough to show up in things, but is that something that could at all affect post-fire the way mortality?
Yeah, actually, a paper came out like 3 months ago or so, looking exactly at that using the 2020 wildfires. But if you recall, the 2021 year was fairly dry, so there were not necessarily important rainfall events in terms of intensity. So to some extent, and similar to what Buzz talked about, what a basin can capture from a paleoecological standpoint, the actual erosion might not necessarily only related to the amount of delay mortality or severity in the first place, but the intensity of the rainfall. So in 1991, there was a small fire that happened on the gorge that was reburned by the 2017 fire. In 1994, we had a lot of atmospheric rivers, and there were big landslides there. The fire wasn't that big, but the actual atmospheric river was huge. And so really, slope and stability might be as important, if not more, than delay mortality.
It's mostly for Matt, but to what extent was the abiotic factors considered as comorbid factors, particularly insects and disease?
We haven't dug into that yet. We haven't. That was sort of strictly a methodological look and some results, but I think that's one of those next steps once we start feeling confident with our maps, is to bring in some of those sorts of things.
Yep.
Really good stuff, Andrés and team. Just trying to wrap my head around that last part you were saying about higher severity. I think you used RDR being associated with higher post-fire mortality. But at some point, if your initial fires killed all the trees, how do you kind of parse that out?
That's a great question. I think especially when we start at this thinking about the stage of translating what this means from a management standpoint, I think that's super important. I don't think that we have actually put much thought on that, in terms of if there's anything left, right? What are thresholds or what are patterns within the high severity burn? It's very different if you have 76% mortality or 95. So the role ecologically of those little bits of trees that are left, it's super important. And so how that threshold actually, what's the shape of that curve, and how that in turn affect delay mortality, no idea. Great question.
I'll just add a little bit of extra context to, we're often thinking about fire severity in terms of a 30-meter pixel, right, which is actually an aggregation of a lot of trees. So, with some of the results Andrés presented in relation to that RBR, while you look at that 30-meter pixel and assume all the trees are dead, when you zoom down into a 5-meter higher resolution remote sensing imagery product, you actually see remaining trees still in that patch. And so, the hypothesis is that fire effects were particularly high within that high severity fire patch at a larger scale, and that led to fire injuries on the individuals that are left within that patch at a higher severity, and in compounding factors with drought and other competition, other pieces increases those individuals' likelihood of experiencing mortality over time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so if you look at, I think a lot of the work that Sharon Hood and Morgan Varner and Phil have done, it's that initial injury to the tree, crown scorch, or however they measure it, that is consistently pops up as their best predictor of whether or not that tree will die in the future. And I think what we've sort of been seeing is that it scales up at that pixel level when you aggregate.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks.